This meeting is being recorded.
Yeah. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. For people who maybe are joining today, the first day, just to introduce myself, my name is Tiina Luige. I am the secretary of the conference. And before we open the meeting, just from me a few housekeeping notices. We expect today over 200 participants, so in order to make it run smoothly, we are asking people who will not speak, please mute your microphones and disable your cameras. But for the speakers, on the contrary, then when you will speak, please put on your cameras so that we could also see you. For asking the floor, please use this icon for raising your hand. For comments and questions, however, we recommend mostly to use the chat. We saw this working very well yesterday, and there were many very useful and informative comments on the chat. The chairs will react to the chat as much as time allows, but in any case, this will be taken into account also when summarizing the session. So we hope that from technological viewpoint, everything today will run smoothly. We learned from a few problems yesterday. And with this, I wish for a fruitful and inspiring meeting for everyone. Thank you. And over to you now, Mario, to open the meeting.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Tiina, for your opening words. I was sort of hoping for Lydia to also say a few words this morning, since we missed you yesterday, if it is okay.
A compensation. Yes. Actually, yesterday I was preparing to say a few words to give a background of our collaboration with the geospatial community, but it worked quite well when I spoke later on to recognize the important role of collaboration. In the case of working together with the geospatial community, would have not been able to reach this without the support from our colleagues in New York, UNSD, but also Eurostat, the colleagues there, and Mariana Kotsova, the Director General. But today is another first, and it's the first time that we are having a joint session of the Conference of European Statisticians and OECD Committee on Statistics and Statistical Policy. The other day, when I had to brief my executive secretary, who is also Under Secretary General of the UN, my boss, and the other directors, I was saying, well, it will be a big challenge to have everything virtual. But on the other hand, we believe that with this meeting and this experience will go into the history of the conference, but not only. I think it may go into the history of UNEC because we had 3 firsts. That's the way I called it. It's the first time that we had a hybrid meeting. That means we had several missions, actually, countries' missions to the UN in Geneva in the room. It's the first time that we had a plenary session together with the geospatial community. And it's the first time that we are having a joint session of the 2 committees. As the agenda describes, it will be split in 2 parts. And it was an amazing experience how we were discussing how to organize this session. And then it was Paul Schreier, I have to recognize here, who said, why don't we have a joint session on this half a day? And we had some preparatory meetings where we had the 2 chairs, Anil Aurora, who is the chair of the OECD committee, and also Mario Brun, who is the chair of Statistics Finland of the conference, and the secretariats. And it has worked very well, and it was a real pleasure working with Paul and his team, and I would like to thank Paul and his team, Natasha, Karen, Blaise, for the excellent collaboration. We have been collaborating in an excellent way for years, and as we often talk with Paul, we do this because we want to do something for the benefit of all member states that are members both of UNEC and OECD. So here is our first. I hope this will also continue in future. So thank you, two chairs, and thank you, Paul, and your team. Over to you, Mario.
Thank you, Lydia. Nice words, and yes, this is something I wanted to also point out from the country perspective. It is very nice that we can have these two sort of conference sessions together, since many of our topics are overlapping, so we can join our work. So this is, like Lydia said, we have a session with two parts. One is organized with UNEC and one is organized by OECD. And I lost some video. I hope you didn't lose me. We will start from the impact of COVID-19 on the evolving role of NSOs as data stewards. COVID has been a challenge and a possibility for many of us, and we have discussed a lot of it, and I hope also these new ways of working, some of them will continue as this common session. Several countries have seized the opportunity to step up the role of NSOs in the conditions of COVID-19 pandemic. And in some cases, NSOs have acquired access to sources they could not access before. We have discussed in Finland many sources, some we have access succeeded, some not yet. In many cases, the NSOs have provided data with increased timeliness, close to real time, for example, number of deaths, and of course, unemployment and so forth. In 2019, the CES had a seminar on data stewardship and producing a paper with recommendations. The COVID-19 pandemic now puts the role of NSOs into a new context. We can look again at the recommendations and identify some good practices and lessons learned. And of course, forward we go, we want to continue. During this session, we have presentations by UNEC, Estonia, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. I give over to Michael at UNEC. Michael, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mario. So I'm trying to share my screen. So can I get a confirmation that my screen can be seen now, the presentation?
Yes, that's fine, Michael.
Thank you very much. Okay, then I start with my presentation. Yes, hello everyone. My name is Michael Nagy. I work with Tina Luige. And many of you have already seen my yesterday's presentation in session 7, where I presented case examples which we collected at the UNEC platform COVID-19 and official statistics from the perspective of statistics and geospatial data used in responding to the current pandemic. My presentation now will give a very short overview on new roles and partnerships that NSOs have taken up in response to the pandemic based on these case examples where we had access to. So I would like to start by recalling one more time that the pandemic fulfills all the criteria of the term disaster according to the Sender framework. And even if the disease came literally out of nowhere for all of us, neither NSOs or the entire conference were hit unprepared. Because in June 2019, the conference adopted its recommendations on the role of official statistics in measuring hazardous events and disasters. And this is why it's also so important to recall the term disaster is relevant here. And the main aims of this document were actually to clarify the role of NSOs and the national statistical systems in providing information related to hazardous events and disasters, and also to identify a couple of practical steps to better support disaster risk management. And this is exactly where we are right now. I copy-pasted this from the recommendations, and what we can see here is that we have a distinction between core roles and tasks and additional roles and tasks that national statistical systems have to take up or are recommended to take up. So what we call core roles and tasks are typically those which are based on typical strengths of NSOs and national statistical systems, and are therefore recommended to be taken up by any national statistical system. The additional ones are very much dependent on the context and the institutional environment in a given country. And the examples that we are presenting now in the next slide, to a large extent falling into this second category. But of course, like in many areas, there's not always black and white. So maybe some of these examples are in between those categories. So this is a short summary from the examples that we collected through this platform. And again, I highly recommend everybody to visit this platform and also to use it to sharing examples. So we have there a section which is called support for managing the crisis. I would prefer calling it support for managing the disaster, but we leave it for the time being, where we have currently 50 examples from 19 different national statistical offices. And we are in a process of updating this with feedback from the UNSD World Bank survey, examples from various webinars, but also from individual feedback that we got from different countries. And some snapshots about some examples on new or additional tasks that we could identify in this country example. So one here is Austria, for example. Austria made a COVID-19 prevalence study with the Medical University of Vienna and the Austria Red Cross. Ireland is running the National COVID-19 Data Hub in collaboration with governmental organizations, research, and also ESRI Ireland. Norway is carrying out research on social distancing and other measures in collaboration with the University of Chicago and the Norwegian Institute of Public Health. Portugal has this weekly fast and exceptional enterprise survey in collaboration with the Banco de Portugal. And in several countries, for example, Estonia, Spain, and also Ghana, who is not a CS member country, but they're also doing it, the use of mobile phone data for monitoring mobility during lockdown. So these are just a few examples, and sorry that I did not mention all the examples here, but this should be also encouraging you to visit the website and to see which of your examples are already there and which of them you would like to share in addition. Some quick observations from this case example. So what we can see is that NSOs adapted their core task very quickly, even under difficult circumstances like lockdown situation and lots of home working from home. So they were very fast in finding workarounds to keep the most important statistical production ongoing, to increase the speed of production and dissemination of important statistics, to implement new data collections, to develop new statistical products, and to strengthen or establish partnerships with health authorities, research, NGOs, and also the private sector. So very important aspects for our discussion also on data stewardship. So what was new for many NSOs? According to these examples, what was really new was like providing modeling and surveillance support in an unusual area. So this is kind of a new area, and this was new and a challenge and also an opportunity for NSOs. Measuring mobility with mobile phone data, exploring this new data source, but having the know-how to how to deal with data protection issues, funding, new partnerships were needed, and finding the right balance between timeliness and accuracy and maintaining trust in official statistics at the same time. So this leads me to my last slide. I'm also pressured here because I'm using a WebEx account that is needed by others. These lessons learned actually come from countries themselves. So we have just taken this from this category, lessons learned. So what we can see is that NSO's core expertise is needed and appreciated in managing COVID-19 by many governmental organizations. So not only by the statistical system itself, but also by other entities. So such as providing official and international comparable information, the experience on quality assurance, the ensuring of transparency, the communication that is needed, and ensuring trust in statistics and indicators, developing new statistics according to international standards, and integration and analysis of data. And it became clear from the lessons learned that in times of crisis, transparent communication is more important than ever, in particular in regard to some policy decisions that might be unpopular and where it's really important to be transparent. Georeference data was key or is key for quick integration of information, for analysis, but also communication. There was a call for more efforts towards digitalization, the importance of collaboration with health authorities. There was a mentioning of there's sometimes still a lack of coordination of statistical outputs within the government, which is also a call for having a clear mandate within the data ecosystem. Sometimes it's difficult to access and make use of new data sources. A good example here was the use of mobile phone data for monitoring mobility. But last but not least, there was a huge innovation boost in several areas of work. And I think the interesting question here is, what will remain after COVID-19 in terms of innovation boost, and what can we learn for data stewardship? And with that, I give back to you, Mario. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Excellent ending words. What can we learn? What can we preserve? I very much like that. Now we have 3 presentations, starting with Mart Maggie from Estonia, and then Bert Krause from the Netherlands, and George Simon Ulrich from Switzerland. I think you don't need me to introduce. If you can, Mart, you start, Bert, you continue. Is that okay? Yes. And then George Simon, I don't see your screen, but I hope you are there. I think Switzerland was on already. So, Mart, you have the floor, please. Unmute your microphone. We can hear you better.
Hello. I hope you hear me now. Thank you. Yes. Sorry. Now you see my screen, I hope, as well. So thank you. Thank you, Mario. And let me just give a very brief overview about our new role in a new data ecosystem. This discussion started a couple of years ago already, but let me say that I think we wasn't really ready that the new rule, what is needed for us, is really come so fast. And even we had a lot of discussions about on a CES level, on OECD level, and different EU meetings. I think there is the points what have been raised both on the last paper, but also paper presented on a current meeting. I think it's very relevant in a current situation with fighting the COVID-19. And my gratitude to Albania, Canada, Ireland, Italy, Netherlands, New Zealand, Poland, and the rest who contributed really to the paper. And honestly, even the paper was put together before the COVID-19. I will draw today major conclusions, what is really as impacted by the COVID-19, and what are the recommendations which are most critical to implement in the current coming years. Our paper listed 21 considerations, which are really important to take into account in a changing ecosystems. They address the different rules to support this rule or the rules what we need to take. I think we need to really work together. We need to share the experience, but also additional recommendation which was put in a paper was that it's good that we develop a common platform where the necessary experience or the templates are structurally divided or given for everyone. But let me dig deeper and highlight what seems to be the major COVID-19 impacts on the strategic questions raised before the pandemic. The pandemic affected all of us. And I think it's the way of working, the rapid information which comes, the granular geospatial information, that's all affects us. I think it was expected, but once again, we wasn't ready for it. So comparing the requests and our support to the society, I can say that even we did well, we still wasn't ready. What I see is there is a major COVID impacts listed on the 4 questions on a screen. So how we can really increase the cooperation in a statistical community to respond on those data platforms and skills gaps. What functions we really need to review, how we can coordinate the data and information between the different information and data providers. Is it now time that the data stewardship is really our new role? And how we can really become more user-centric or the client-friendly, I will say, with giving a more real-time information in a society. Before providing you major consideration and recommendations, please let me explain the major challenges we faced in our work during the pandemic. The first one, the Cabinet of Estonia requested Estonia to provide mobility and analysis during the COVID-19 lockdown to monitor the lockdown rules. The request was passed us for 7 days, and we was ready to provide information back in 14 days. The data were based on transmitting data and enabled to monitor on a polygon level and on a country level situation on a daily basis. Even though it was no obligation to the mobile operators to cooperate, an agreement was reached on a benefit of the society. This case shows very clearly that a need for the privately held data, but it shows also there is a huge need for strategic communication to all stakeholders. And the key of it is keeping the public trust. Its case shows also the need of linking different data sources, creating a methodology very quick. The outcome was highly appreciated by the Estonian media and society. On the top of the slide, you see also my reference to the particular recommendations, what was in a paper. The recommendations about the new roles. Recommendation, for example, the use of privately held data, or the recommendation about the additional levels of the confidentiality and protection. Similarly to other countries, Statistics Estonia also was appointed immediately by the cabinet as a central coordinator and producer of different social and economic indicators. There is a clearly shift now from the yearly indicators to the monthly or the weekly or even on a daily information. Even Estonia and all the Nordic countries have a long history in producing statistics on a register based and the public data sources. It's still a huge opportunity, and not only opportunity, but it's also a hard work to get this data in a very, very quickly and also providing to the society so that the methodology is visible and understandable. It's the case of time indicators with analytical capabilities. So let me highlight 7 major considerations among those 21 general considerations what are listed in a paper. I think those 7 are really the most critical which are now we need to take in our everyday life. So we should start the discussions about really what are the legal system enabling the use of privately held data. It is important that we are, with the governments, are elaborating the national data strategies. There is many different opportunity which role we take, but the data strategies is needed to really respond quickly to the needs of society. There is also very clear need to share the experience, because even we have now the new indicators, the harmonizing those will take time. There is need also to secure that the quality is sufficient in administrative sources. The communication is one of the key points, but the key points also that we need to work together with our key clients, the customers, to deliver the indicators as the need is definitely changed. To do those things, I think we need to have more analytical capabilities. So we are really taking not only the data governance position, but also the central position of the data science. So let me conclude. The framework of the official statistics should be really enlarged by the new roles. It's not coming overnight. It's a discussion between all of us. The scope of the NSOs is widening as the new data sources become available, but also the expectations for us is clearly changed. Effective communication promoting what NSOs have to offer is crucial for creating win-win partnership, both with the data providers, but also with the government and other in a private sector. The international statistical community could widen its role and scope, developing new partnerships, also on an international level. I think the specific action plan is now needed, supporting the NSOs as taking the larger part of the new data system. And as I mentioned, let's start with the very small pieces, having a common platform at least, where we see the good practices we can take into account already today. That's all. Thank you.
Microphone.
Can you now see and hear? Yes, I see Mario Concept. So thank you. Great to give some overview. This basically starts where Michael Nagy ended. Lots of things have been going on in this corona crisis, and well, it gives a lot of innovation boost and other role for us in society and the government. So what does it mean for us? And I gave this presentation the title From Statistical Institutes Towards Data Partner for Government. Well, as other institutes, other NSIs in this COVID crisis, we've got different roles. First of all, we help government use existing data for policies. And this is not as straightforward as it looks. There's a lot of data around that can be used. We've got a direct link with our National Crisis Center. They want to know how many people are at occupations that need to be able to walk around freely, like nurses, etc. We give information on the labor market, like self-employed people, how many financial resources they have, how long they can take out being closed. We give information about care homes, information how many people live there, what regions, all information that was already there that we did not need to change, but we bring to the attention of government to use it. So really help the data that's already there to be used in this crisis and help shape forming the policies. The second role is that we improve timeliness and frequency of regular statistics, basically similar to what Mart said. Especially the weekly mortality statistics were important because they were a good addition to these corona-tested statistics from our health authorities. Weekly statistics on retail trade using scanner data, weekly data on energy use says something about industrial production, but also weekly data about bankruptcies because it says something on the impacts of the economic crisis. Not much to be seen yet because of the emergency measures. So we improve timeliness and frequency of our statistics and basically talking to government what they need. And also new statistics using new data. First of all, on the emergency measures, what countries are helped, how many people are getting support, does it help, what kind of sectors, but also on mobility using public transport, individual data. And we're now discussing using data on individual COVID tests, because if you can link that to our population register, this is great information for our health policy makers, how the infection spread goes. So basically, these are the three main things we do. And the first thing is not the most unimportant, just helping people shape their policy using data, because there's a huge gap between the policymakers and the people who have data, like us. So there's a big need for data stewardship. If you look at our government, where are they now busy with? What are the questions our policymakers are pondering? Well, they're talking about lifting of the restrictions, how fast and what. Every month the restrictions are lifted somewhat more, but government is still mainly working from home. I'm sitting in my study room at home also. But what are the effects for the economy, for the spreading of the virus, but also how to organize and monitor public transport. We're a small country. Many people go to train and buses to work. This is places where the infection spread goes very quickly. But if you shut down public transport, can people go to work? What does it mean for economy? Emergency support for which companies? We don't want to support every company, but want to make the transition to the new economy. Companies that can be energy efficient, the new green economy that can survive in the digital age. So invest in something that's future-proof. And the new economically vulnerable groups, the self-employed people, but also the digitally less fortunate people, because we made just a big jump in the digital economy. And all these questions, these are pondered by our policymakers, and they're all wanting data. They not only want data, but also want to know how can data support the policy? How can they use the data to make the right decisions? And what we find out is that this is very uncertain times for these policymakers. I'm not jealous of our Minister President who has to make all these difficult decisions. And what I see is that solid ground under the feet is important. So there's a big need for data, but also in help people use the data. So we participate in the most important government think tanks. We have intensive dialogue with policymakers. And if I have one effect of the crisis, apart from the innovation boost, is our direct contacts with the people who really make the decisions, because they need the data and they need help how to make use of the data for their work. Well, the second thing is there's clear need for data governance. And basically, the main question is, how can you use the available data such that the value for society is maximized under the condition that democratic values are secured? At the moment, there's an emergency law in our parliament allowing us to make use of mobile telephone data. Well, this is very sensitive and political issues. I mean, it does something with privacy. You follow people, at least you collect information where people go. But on the other hand, there's a huge use for it. Our health authorities want to know what are the migration patterns. If there's an outbreak in one city, do we have to warn the other city? Do people adhere to the emergency measures? So there's a trade-off between this value for society and democratic values. And this is a political issue, and it is rightly political, because politicians have to decide on that. So this kind of discussions will come more and more. But there's also a lack of knowledge what's already possible. We see a lot of fear also to make use of possibilities that are there. There's a lot of focus on risk of using data. There's lack of coordination in my country. Sometimes I'm jealous of Estonia. So people not working together as they could. And I think opportunities are lost. We're not doing badly, both in the statistical field and using data in the other way. We're doing good things. But there's clearly a need for data governance, making it clearer how to collect data, how to match data, how to use data, and how you can, within the current legislation, use data for better policy making, and we need better data governance for that. So, as I said, situation in the Netherlands, we're a bit scattered. E-government responsibility for 3 departments: Ministry of Justice for cybersecurity, Ministry of Interior Affairs for the government data policy, and the Ministry of Economic Affairs for the whole sharing of data between businesses and government. But also our provinces and municipalities have their own approach, and many position papers call for more and better coordination of digitalization and data. So what we see from the COVID crisis is that data can do a lot. There's a huge boost in what data can do, but it also comes forward that the possibilities to share data, to match data, and to use data can be used a lot better. And this gives a boost to our proposition to invest more in that. And that's good. So our role is not from scratch. We already have a strong position as CBS on data. Obviously, we make statistics, but all the data we collect for statistics, we make available for scientific research and for statistical research. So we do that by remote access. So there are many institutions in the Netherlands and outside who can approach our microdata, also bring their own data. So we're basically a data hub for statistics and science. And that's much further than all our own data and statistics. Open data, we publish everything. Our own data is open data, but we also publish open data for others. So we help the police and others to and the Ministry of Environment to make their data open using our API, so having possibilities to use that data better for everything, also for the private world. We've got a CBS Academy, which basically gives courses in data science, but not so much the technical stuff, more how can you use data that it really matters, that really there's better policy for self-employed people, for people in care homes, for mobility. How do you really bridge the gap between policymakers and the data people? We're a member of the National AI Coalition, where, there's a lot of money invested, $2 billion the coming 7 years, I think, euros, of course, we're in Europe. So really making AI work for our government, but again, the democratic values are important. So transparency, fair algorithms, privacy. We're a member of that and influential then. And as I said before, and coming back to Michael Nagy's end, the COVID crisis has led to more urgency and increased role of us. We're more visible even in where really the policymakers make the decisions, and the questions about data governance are more prominent. Every day there are debates in the papers on what can data do on the one hand, on the other hand, the risk of privacy, and do we want Big Brother? So this is going to a political level, and I think that's all right in a democracy. So my last slide, next year we have elections, and I think the whole idea of national data strategy will play a role. Of course, we've got some strategies already, but I think it will be strengthened. And there are a number of reasons for it. One of the reasons I said before, but also there's many discussions in our newspapers now about government services, the tax authority checking on fraud, the benefits authorities checking on fraud, but also municipalities trying to find the poor people. Where are the people who need help? Individual helping. And there's some scandals, government institutions going too far, using data they shouldn't have, doing profiling, but also discussions, we don't know enough. There's data there and we cannot do nothing. So there's discussion there. This is not statistical field. This is really use of data by these government institutions helping and checking people. But also the data economy and data sharing. This connects to the European data strategies, the idea of common European data spaces? How do you make data flow freely under democratic conditions? How do you ensure that there's huge boost to the economy using data? And how we sure that for us, the Dutch companies can make profits and make a living? Also AI, the political debate about AI is much devoted to risks. How do you prevent profiling? How do you prevent unfair algorithms? How do you prevent intransparency, machines making decisions on people we don't understand? And that's right. It's good that these discussions are there, but there's also opportunities of AI, opportunities of better public services, better climate approaches, better medical systems. And all these decisions, all these discussions, how you use data, how you make better use of data, how you use data for a better society, and on the other hand, democratic principles and guarantees. So I think these will all come back more and more in our society, will play a role in our data strategies, and we as CBS will play a role. At the moment, we're contributing to shaping this strategy, giving our expertise, bringing in our knowledge, but also we will play a role in its execution, obviously in the field of making statistics, but also in the data hub for statistical and scientific services connected to the remote access facilities that we also already have. But we also want to give expertise to this broader data strategy. As CBS, we cannot be responsible for our tax authorities checking on people, but we can give information we have how to do this data governance, bringing in expertise. So I think COVID crisis has many very bad consequences on people, on the economy, but also that we have to do these meetings on video and not in a great room in Geneva having nice lunches and dinners with all of us. But it also has given additional urge to what data can bring, the need for data strategy, and it also has absolutely increased the profile of NSOs and what we can contribute to society. So thank you, Mario.
Good.
Hello, everybody. Unfortunately, George Ulrich cannot attend the meeting, so my name is Manuela Lenk. I'm responsible for innovation at the Federal Statistics Office, and in the next few minutes, I will speak about the changes in the data ecosystem and the targets of the Swiss National Data Management Program. I will focus on the Swiss Data Steward and the statistics roles for standardization and harmonization of data for nationwide public administration. The aim of all this work and initiatives is simplification for companies and citizens through the once only principle. What are the changes and solutions in the National Statistical Institute? In the modern state, the role of National Statistical Institutes is changing from a classical statistical office to an institute for data management in a broad-based data ecosystem. The federalist structure in Switzerland, with the other national statistics producers and all other administrative units that keep data, is a great asset and it needs to be taken into account. The key concept is to keep data storage and ownership decentralized in the individual administrative and statistical units, but to make the data available and reusable by sharing it with other units. Interoperability of data is a key pillar for introducing the once only principle for data collection and reuse. Another key feature of the new system is the creation of a center of expertise for data science at the Federal Statistical Office. This center will focus know-how in this field and benefit the whole of the federal administration by offering data innovation services to all. The once-only principle is the target of the interoperability. Establishing the once-only principle requires interoperability in order to realize data integration, exchange and sharing across units and to enable the multiple use of the data. A first step towards implementation of interoperability consists in the development of nationwide metadata catalog containing standardized and harmonized descriptions, as well as information about provenience, usage, legal restrictions, and quality of shared data. The role model with central and centralized local roles is besides the organization and the defined process, a key element to reach the interoperability of data. There are two central roles, with the Swiss data steward and the data steward statistics, which are located both at the Swiss Statistical Office. The other roles in the role model are located in the administrative units and by other national statistics producers. As shown in the image, the statistics domain has its own two roles, with the data steward statistics and the local data steward statistic. The Swiss data steward is centrally located in our office and is responsible for coordinating the standardization and harmonization process nationwide, identifying and describing the data requirements of the various users, managing the content of metadata, and validating the quality assurance of metadata and data in the administrative areas using data analysis. The data steward statistic is located in our office as well and is responsible for cooperation and coordination with international bodies, enabling the use of common international classification standards, further developing guidelines for implementing the once-only principle in the statistical field, validating the quality assurance of the statistics producers, and defining standards and guidelines for nomenclatures and metadata. The responsibilities of the local data stewards in the public administration are standardization of harmonization of data within area of responsibility, validation of the quality assurance of metadata and data in the administrative area by means of data analysis, and further development of specifications to ensure interoperability. In addition to the local data stewards, the local data steward statistics is responsible for following tasks: standardization and harmonization of statistical data within area of responsibility, and identifying and describe the data needs of the various users in the statistical field. This is the target image of the interoperability with the participating units and roles. It covers not only administrative units, it takes into account not only administrative bodies, but also the private sector and the research. The main focus in the first step is to reach the interoperability of data between the federal offices, but also with the cantons. We develop a so-called interoperability platform, a nationwide data catalog with harmonized and standardized metadata. There one can find all information nationwide. How we have tackled the tasks. The program National Data Management was launched in October 19. The current steps anticipate the implementation of several projects which will be carried out within specified areas, for example, occupational profiles, taxes, and so on. I have already shown the meaning of data science in the introduction to this presentation. Data science is also becoming increasingly important for the public administration. It covers intelligent calculation processes which make it possible to automate solving complex tasks, including AI. The Federal Statistical Office will launch this interdisciplinary center as of 1st January next year. As the competence center for official statistics in Switzerland, we have many years of experience in dealing with complex issues and large volumes of data. This new center will support the whole federal administration so it can carry out projects with drawn-up data science. Individual offices will not have to build up their own expertise in this complex and volatile area, but instead will be able to buy in the services of the FSO's Data Science Center. With its wealth of experience in data quality and the various methods of data processing, a National Statistical Office is the natural choice to carry out these tasks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. Very, very interesting presentations. Mart, Bert, and Marina. I got your name right, I hope. Now we have had very good comments on the chat, and we do have time for some discussion on the floor. But first, I give the floor to Padraig from Ireland to say a few words about the paper by Ireland. Padraig, please.
Thank you, Mario. Can you hear me? I'm going to assume that you can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine, Padraig.
Okay, great. So first of all, good morning or good afternoon to everybody, depending on where you are. Just a couple of comments on the broader issue of data stewardship. And I suppose we're very conscious here that data stewardship can mean different things to different people. And that's okay. I think that's important to recognize. Our starting point was to look at experience internationally. We looked at what Mark was doing in Estonia, Anil and his team in Canada, Mark and his team in New Zealand. So we looked at what was happening internationally. And when you look at it, there's a lot of overlap between what we're doing. So there's a core set of services and activities that fall clearly into the data stewardship piece. But there are also differences. And for me, that highlights a key point, and that is that context and environment are key. So you need to identify the data stewardship role that will add value within your own environment and your own context. So when we think about it, we're looking at it now in the sense that the CSO is not just a compiler of data and insight. We're now a provider of services, and in particular data services, and we've tried to highlight that in the paper. And I think the trick is to work out what services you need to provide and you can provide within your environment and within your context. And I think you need to think about that not just from one perspective, in other words, the perspective of the policymaker. I think you need to think about that in the context of your broadest cohort of users, including, I like to call the man on the street. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're not engaging with the man on the street, there's, your relevance is going to be questionable over time. And I think that's really, really important. When you're looking at the services you want to provide, I think it's really important that you reflect and you make sure that the service you provide need to be consistent with your mandate, and they also need to ensure that you stay true to the core values of official statistics. And I think that's really important. So in our context, we've identified for ourselves what we're going to do, but you'll also see in the paper, we've made it very clear what we're not going to do. And that's really, really important as well, is that you're clear about what you're not willing to do and what services you won't provide. And we like to describe it as what we will do versus what we will facilitate others to do. Because I think if you do the data stewardship piece right, you will develop data sources right across the system that are not just valuable for statistical reasons, but also of value for administrative purposes. And if you can develop the data sources within administrative systems according to best standards, you're going to increase the quality and the insight that can be gained from that data for a whole range of users. So if you do this right, you'll enhance trust, but you'll also enhance relevance of the NSI. And I think that's really, really important. So we've been working on this for quite some time, long before COVID-19, but the very short paper we've submitted to the CES, we've written in the context of COVID-19, because I think it turns data stewardship from a concept into something tangible. So it shows you in a very real way how you can put the whole data stewardship role into effect in practice. And I think that's really important. We have a plan and a direction of travel, but it's set very much in our context. So I'm not here today saying that read the Irish paper or read the Estonian paper or read the Canadian paper and that's your blueprint. I think what it is starting point for you to start thinking about what type of data stewardship role you could play within your environment. It needs to work. It needs to work out. You need to work out what it means for you within your statistical system. I just want to say finally, so that's the general thought on data stewardship, and I think that the three presentations were fantastic, and there's undoubtedly fantastic work going on across NSIs right across the globe. But I think the challenge for us now is how do we build on those successes? There's an opportunity now. An awful lot of NSIs have really increased their relevance nationally. And the last thing you want to do is lose the opportunity that's been presented. And I think that's something that we could work very well together on within this international community of the CES to try and work together to see what are the areas that we need to prioritize and focus on in the next 3 to 6 months. I think it needs to be quite quick that we build on this because the opportunity is there. Thank you very much, Mario.
Thank you, Patrick. Good points you raised. And so you are asking the audience to come up with ideas what should be done within 6 to 9 months. Was that correct? Of course, other discussions may also come up. So Steve will be Steve has been sort of watching the chat, which is quite active. Steve, can you sort of make a wrap up if there is any questions, what kind of comments, what other things we should discuss? Steve, please.
So, thank you, Mario. Yes, very active chat and quite a challenge to keep up with it all. And I think mostly comments. I'll come to a few questions in a minute. But, for example, information, various countries, what they're doing. So, for example, countrywide studies in Austria, use of telecoms and mobility data in New Zealand, where they were also interested to see what others have done. So a reminder there that we can share the examples on the current platform. That's a good place to share this sort of information. We had support for a common platform from Austria, and we also had comments about the importance of a good legal basis from Colombia and the importance of coordination of international activities from Mexico. We've also had, I think, quite a bit of a discussion developing on the chat about the role of NSOs related to private data sources. This role also of a statistics provider versus certifying agents and all of those other sorts of roles that we may have, and the need to find a balance that helps us to preserve trust whilst also being able to react quickly. Dominic also added about the dimension of access to new sources. And I think there's an underlying theme that the current crisis gives us an opportunity. We had a comment which I'm just trying to spot, yes, from Anil, which was actually something I also saw when I was thinking this morning about the session, the Winston Churchill quote about not wasting a good crisis. And I think what we're seeing here is some good examples of how we are using, in a way, the current crisis to best effect for the national statistical systems. So coming to some of the questions, I have also some questions submitted in advance by Mexico, and I picked up also some points from the chat. But I think good questions for the speakers and for the audience generally would be about how to manage aspects like quality and data confidentiality across rapidly evolving data ecosystems. That was raised in advance by Mexico. And also from the chat, a very interesting question from Anil that sparked a bit of debate there. maybe we can continue that in the discussion, which is about where should the role of an independent National Statistical Office start and end, and the issue of getting close to sort of politics with data access. So times are changing, our roles are changing very quickly. How do we manage that role and manage the boundaries of the roles? So I think there's some very interesting, quite difficult questions maybe for our presenters and others to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I would sort of I see that we have a few active participants on the chat, but I don't see anybody raising a hand. But maybe our presenters would like a word. If I give the floor to you, Mart, any comments?
Yes, thank you. I think that the quality is really important, the privacy as well. But let me say that also in a chat room, I see a lot of discussions about metadata. And honestly, my personal view on it is we need to tackle, first of all, with the quality of metadata. So that's something very important to understand where the data is and what the data means in a public administrative sources. And that's a starting point. So if we can tackle this one at the first, then we can, of course, develop also further the recommendations for the data quality across different sources. But the metadata comes first, because what we see that there is a lot of different administrative sources are available or are opened for statistical purposes as well. But nevertheless, even they're available, the understanding, what does it mean? And also, could we use it for a statistical purpose? This is not clear. So therefore, the metadata is something where we can start, really. Thank you.
Thanks, Mart. Bert, any comments from your side? I think you have still your microphone off, Bert.
So you missed everything I said. Okay, I'll start anew. I was reading out the comment of Anil in the chat. He says, we do find ourselves in a situation where companies with high volumes and timely data are producing statistics as public good, and statistical agencies have major impediments to data access for public good. What does this mean? And this is a comment that's very prominent in our public debate at the moment. For example, as I said, this emergency law is now in Parliament. And basically, this emergency law gives us, CBS, the right to access telephone data for the public good, for making statistics for our health authorities. And obviously, there are 20 pages of questions by the members of Parliament and 35 pages of answers by government. And many of the questions and answers go in the direction, can't we use analysis that are already there? And then both some members of Parliament, as the government says, there's Google mobility information, but this is intransparent how they do it. We don't know the methods. And also, we don't want to be dependent on something where there's so many privacy concerns. So if I talk to, yesterday I talked to the director of our privacy authority. I talked to private institutions like Bits of Freedom, Privacy First, so the civil societies. And this is always an argument that holds. Government needs data on mobility, on everything. They don't want to dependent on private companies that they don't control in a democratic way, even if we all tick the boxes that they can use the data for whatever we want. So the argument that we are the democratic controlled institute that makes it possible to give the information using the private information in the way that government can control really makes sense to both members of parliaments and the privacy organizations. And this is an experience I wanted to share, but so you can position yourself as using this private data in a way that government and society can control and still providing useful insights. And the policies have to decide what we can do and we can't do. And obviously, it's only about statistics, about groups, not individual mobility, of course, for our.
Gilbert, I give over to Manuela, please.
Yes, thank you. I think we have two heads now. We have the head of the statistical issues and the head of the administrative issues that we get new in Switzerland. For example, in the Competence Center of Data Science, we don't deal only with statistical data. We deal with administrative data for the administrative world, and we have to strict. We have to look that we strict go for the statistics world and the other issues for the administrative world, and don't to mix it. But we have two heads now. I think so.
That seems to be sort of a clear cut in Switzerland. So I see that Australia is commenting on the chat. Maybe you could voice your comment out loud. Australia, please.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Paul asked the question about whether early estimates were being sought and accepted, and we're certainly finding in Australia that is the case. We are releasing a number of indicators partially processed, but where we are still fairly confident of the underlying accuracy, and users are accepting that well and not over-interpreting. And I echo the comment from New Zealand that we are now entering a period of debate as to whether this should be a more permanent arrangement. Thank you.
Yes, that's one thing that we have also discussed is statistical areas are different. Some areas do not need maybe the precise accuracy as other areas, but this is a big discussion, and of course it has to be transparent what the accuracy is. Thank you. Then I give over to Padraig again, and then I have some other active participants, but please raise your hand if you want to comment. Padraig, please.
Thank you, Mario. I just think it's a very interesting debate on the chat about this whole trade-off between quality and timeliness. And certainly, like Teresa has just outlined from Australia, what we are finding is that users in Ireland have been looking for more timely data. And while they want it to be the highest quality that it can be, they are willing to accept data that's not perfect as long as it provides insight. And that's certainly what we've been trying to do. And I think Mark has really asked the question is, and I'm trying to answer this question myself, so how do we build on this into the future? We're now talking about developing a kind of a new product or a new suite of products, and we don't have a name for it yet, but it's something along the line of real-time estimates or flash estimates, where they're designed to produce an indication of the trend or direction of travel, rather than to be taken as literal interpretations of the level of a particular piece. Now, there are some real-time estimates that will be very accurate, and that will depend on the data source. But there are other products and services that we provide where we'll have to challenge that conundrum of, as statisticians, we want everything to be extremely robust and extremely accurate, but sometimes the trade-off to get there is timeliness, and by the time you produce it, it's too late. And I think that's the one thing we've learned in this crisis, is that decision makers, particularly in a crisis, they need information fast. And it's just about being very clear. I mean, our sense is that if you're clear with the customer what the strengths of this figure is and what the weaknesses of the figure is, there's generally an acceptance of that. And we would never publish something that we would say would be misleading. But I certainly think it's it's a new world for us. And I'll be honest with you, I was one of those people that was slow to adopt the idea of flash estimates, but my mind has changed on foot of the crisis. And the next thing to do is, how are we going to differentiate these new products from the traditional products of the NFS or the Silk or the national accounts? So that's really, I think that's part of the challenge that we have to face into. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. It's exactly the same thing like everybody is commenting. Also in Finland, we are doing things like that. One thing I wanted to comment regarding the quality of the administrative data, we have succeeded in when we have had the data policy discussion in Finland and the data, whatever policy act or whatever it's called in English, we suggested a data quality framework for administrative data, and now we are leading the work. And all the data providers who have the biggest basic registers are in with the work. So this is a step that we have taken for data quality. Thank you. Anybody else that would like to take the floor? You are good in writing. It seems that nobody wants to talk.
I'm happy to speak.
Yes?
I'm happy to speak. Jim Diamond from the UK. Can you hear me? The point that I just wanted to make is that I'm not entirely clear when people are talking about reducing quality, what they mean. I think it is very dangerous for National Statistics Institute to start saying, well, we're just going to give you some rubbish data, but it's quick. I do think we are producing very timely data. We also know that they are very accurate data. There's absolutely, completely accuracy in it. And that is either through big surveys that instead of waiting some weeks, we are working our analysis through so we can produce those data weekly, or through the use of administrative data. So, for example, we would all recognize that the labour force survey is fairly delayed. That, for the UK, is currently showing no impact of COVID. Well, that doesn't make a lot of coherent sense. But actually, what we are then showing is, let's look at the number of vacancies. That's completely accurate. Let's look at the number of people on the payroll using administrative data. That's completely accurate. Let's look at other indicators and bring them together. For example, the number of people furloughed, completely accurate. Number of claims for benefits, completely accurate. So we're showing different data, but they are accurate data. They are not lacking in quality in any way. And I do think that we as National Statistical Institutes, to retain our credibility, needs to be careful about using words like trading quality. We certainly are not doing that in the UK. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Good discussion. I give now the floor to Colombia. Colombia, please.
Thank you very much for such an interesting discussion. In the case of Colombia, when we see the role of data stewardship following the important discussions at the international community, we have decided to prove or to test the possibility of having a collegiate approach of data stewardship. So taking into account that the Statistics Office should be independent, we decided to develop a collegiate body that puts together the Statistical Office, the Ministry of Planning, and the Data Protection Authority, which is the competition authority in our country. And the three of us, we started to have a conversation in order to see which are the main requirements of public policy as far as defining new information or new considerations of information production in our country. And this has been very useful in the current situation of the COVID-19 crisis in Colombia, because it has helped us to define a very fast answer to cross together the statistical information of the population census and the very detailed and granular health records of all the population in our country, respecting confidentiality, but allowing at the same time this information to illustrate some behaviors that the Colombian citizens should follow, taking into account the vulnerability from comorbidities and some other risks from the demographic perspective that they face currently as far as the COVID-19. So probably the discussion of where should we stand in the data stewardship could be an equilibrium between interdisciplinary dialogues that we should foster inside the government and the state, respecting the independence of the statistical office, respecting the privacy concerns that are very important, but at the same time, something that Julian mentioned in the chat, to be fit for purpose and to say that if we have to provide sound answers in the current situation, probably we could act fastly in order to provide those answers to society. So this is what we wanted to share our experience in Colombia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I totally agree from my perspective that if the discussion of data stewardship has to be within the government with other institutions. It's not up to statistical offices only. And I think that this has been discussed many times. So congratulations to you, Colombia. The discussion is getting very, very, very interesting and the chat is excellent. Unfortunately, I think I'm looking at my clock and we are running out of time, but I will give to Steve, back to UNEC, to Steve to summarize, try to summarize the discussion somehow. Steve, you have the floor, please.
Okay, thank you, Mario. I'm just in the process of sharing my screen. So we've been putting together some ideas on conclusions, but I should say beforehand that there is such a wealth of material in the chat that we will go through that and we will summarize it. And also, the process is that because this is an informal session, we will have chairs' conclusions, which will be then reviewed by the Bureau at their next meeting. And that, of course, will be shared with you all as well. So these are draft conclusions proposed by the Secretariat, which may be modified as needed by the Chair, just so that you're clear what we're showing here. So I think one thing that is clear, the role of national statistical offices is definitely changing in response to new demands and opportunities. That's nothing new. It's been happening for quite a while now. But it's really being accelerated by the COVID-19 crisis or disaster, if I look at my colleague Michael. We're seeing developments that used to take years or months happening now in weeks or days. We're seeing the challenges and the possibilities of a crisis, and back to the Churchill quote about making the most of the crisis. Also, we see that there are perhaps some different ideas about how national statistical offices should position themselves within the new data ecosystem. Padraig said something very important, that context and environment are key. So that means it's quite difficult to find a strong common position. So we see a range of possibilities, from minimal change to the pre-COVID situation to a full data stewardship role with stewardship of data across government. Each National Statistical Office, therefore, has to sort of find its place on this continuum. And in that, we recognise that national statistical offices are at different starting points. Some already have cross-government roles to some extent. And again, I think there will be no one-size-fits-all solution. Several people mentioned the importance of communication with policymakers and other data holders. And linked to that is points coming from the discussion in the chat about the importance of transparency. If we have new or experimental data in response to the crisis, then we should be transparent about the quality, we should provide the metadata, and we should focus on maintaining trust. Also, an important point from the chat is that international collaboration between initiatives is needed. So then, some proposals from the Secretariat on the way forward. So, things are changing quickly at the moment. Can I ask colleagues to please mute the microphone? I think Czech Republic. Thank you. So things are changing very quickly. We need to continue the discussion. We saw from the chat that I think we could probably continue for another 4 or 5 hours at least here, but obviously we don't have that possibility today. We need to find ways to keep sharing ideas and experiences. So we had an idea that maybe a task force under the CES could expand on the considerations in the Estonia paper. So take those considerations and maybe flesh them out a bit, maybe review them a little bit in the context of the COVID crisis, and develop some sort of either roadmap or action plan. These are terms that have been used in different presentations or papers. Something that will support national statistical officers as they try to work out what their new role should be. This should take into account the legal basis, as several mentioned in the chat, and it should also take into account that statistical officers need to move at their own pace and stop where they want, which sort of fits a maturity model approach. Now, maturity models are an idea that has been tried in some of the high-level group for modernization of official statistics activities, and was also part of the UNECE Statistical Capacity Development Strategy approved by the CES 2 years ago. So I think here we can look at different levels of maturity so that organizations can decide where they are now and where they want to be and have some sort of roadmap or action plan to maybe help them step to the next level. And to support all of that, we should, I think, be collecting and sharing examples of good practice on the web platform. But as well as what works, it's also good, I think, to have information about mistakes or what doesn't work. Something like, we tried this, but it doesn't work. Don't bother trying that yourselves. And finally, that the Bureau will follow up on the discussion today and on these ideas, and that the CES should review progress next year. So that would also fit with the 6 to 9 month timetable that Padraig mentioned, which I think is important. We should do something relatively quickly. So they are the draft conclusions and the ideas for the way forward from the Secretariat. Now back to Mario for the Chair's conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I quite like your conclusions. We will have to sort of go through the chat and go through your conclusion suggestions and continue from there. But definitely this is a topic that we will need to keep on working. And I think we know that even though there are many of these examples, and at the moment we feel that this is a national discussion, we need to have the international sort of statistical family support, and it is some sort of guidelines or something would be useful. To me, I think when I read about data stewardship, English not being my mother tongue, data is what kind of we use the same word in Finnish, but what do we mean when we talk about data? To me, when I have thought in our office about data stewardship or data policy, I would start with the government data, so the data that the government has hold of, and then the private sector data, of course, that government gets is one part, but leave that out at this moment in my discussion. And then the stewardship, it's not a strange word, but how we define what is stewardship when we combine it with data is of course another question. I think we can understand this in different ways. So this is, but this will all evolve when we discuss and share our experiences. So I think this is a very good way forward. Anyhow, this will end our session. And surprise, surprise, also virtual meetings can have breaks. So we still have, because we are supposed to start the next session 5:30, we have 5 minutes. Let's say we have 5 minutes break and then we come back. You can, of course, keep on chatting because nobody's closing this up. Thank you, everybody. Is there anything from the Secretariat, any announcements, Tina, that you would want to make at this point?
No, thank you. We will, I think, run these nice memories from the previous and also even from this session during the small break, but then we continue at 1:30 our time, whatever it is your time. So see you in a few minutes.
Very good. Good afternoon. This is Paul Schreier from the OECD. Let me kick off this afternoon session and immediately turn to Anil for a few words of welcome.
Thank you very much, Paul. Welcome, colleagues, to this second part of the informal joint seminar between the Conference of European Statisticians and the Committee on Statistics and Statistical Policy of the OECD. It's my pleasure as chair of the OECD CSSP to introduce this particular session. The presentations and discussions so far this week, I think you'll agree, have shown the energy, the power of partnerships and collaboration, the innovation potential and ingenuity of the statistical community to bring greater value both globally and nationally. And I believe the upcoming panel discussion will further demonstrate these traits. The goal of this session, this discussion, is to tease the main lessons that have been learned so far from the current crisis and focusing specifically on business continuity. You'll all hear from Tudorel Andrei, president of the Romanian National Statistical Institute, from Mariana Coțeva, director general of Eurostat, Brian Moyer, the acting US chief statisticians, and Mark Sowden, New Zealand government statisticians. So to set the stage for this discussion and keep us on track, I turn it right back to our panel moderator, Mr. Paul Schreier. Over to you, Paul.
Many thanks, Anil, for that introduction. I'd also want to echo the thanks that Lydia announced this morning for the possibility to have a joint session. I think this is really good going forward. As you will have noticed, the two topics that we've been looking at, the role of NSOs and business continuity, are closely linked, and one is really triggered by the other. So I think the two sessions fit very nicely together. We already heard a number of times over the last couple of days, actually, how the crisis put a massive premium on timeliness and granularity of our statistics, how innovative solutions were being pursued in countries. Sometimes discussions arose, and we just had one before, we may have others, about whether there is a trade-off between different dimensions of quality, maybe not. I should also ask that certainly from our perspective and looking at the international discussions, COVID has brought out a number of methodological questions that used to be of a more academic nature before, and suddenly have come center stage because they make a difference to our numbers, be it in the area of unemployment statistics, be it in the area of CPIs. So there are a number of things that have surfaced because of the very unusual situation. COVID has also brought out a number of structural issues in our national statistical systems. We heard some of those. I read and I invite you all to take a look at the excellent report that INSEE has put together, which is on your website, actually. And I think there are one or two lines where they talk about the collection of mortality data in France. And it turns out that a number of communities are still sending this data in by mail. And you can imagine, this is obviously an issue for the efficiency of the generation of mortality data. So a number of these things that typically don't matter all that much suddenly have come through. That is one of the reasons why we organized this session, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our panelists first and from the rest of the group afterwards. We have two rounds for the panelists. First, we will have a short presentation by each of them to share with us the national or international experiences. We will then open up for questions and comments, and then come back to the panelists for a quick round looking ahead, lessons to be drawn, where do we go from here. Anil already mentioned that we have four panelists. We will start out with Brian Moyer, who is the acting US chief statistician. We will then follow on with Tudorel Andrei, who is the president of the Romanian Statistical Institute, followed by Mariana Coțeva, Director General of Eurostat, and Mark Sowden, the New Zealand government statistician. In the interest of time, we have actually compiled the PowerPoints and we will run them centrally from here. So as we go on, I would just ask you to indicate when you want to switch to the next slide, and we will do so. On that, without further ado, let me turn to Brian Moyer for the first intervention, and he will be followed by a tutorial in a little while afterwards. So we're just putting up the slides, and I think you can all see those, and I therefore turn over to Brian. Good morning to the US.
Good morning, Paul. Thank you so much. I hope everyone is doing well, and I'm very pleased to be part of this morning's discussion. So let's go to the next slide, please. As most of you know, the U.S. statistical system is a highly decentralized system, as you can see there on this first slide. All told, it consists of about 125 different agencies. Let's go to the next slide, please. The COVID-19 pandemic has certainly challenged and impacted all of those agencies in one way or another. I've listed here on this slide some of the most significant impacts. So you can see things like disruptions to data collection and field operations, lower response rates, breaks in time series, and some significant gaps in the data required to build major economic aggregates, things like GDP. And while we're dealing with all of these technical challenges, we're also facing the ever increasing demands for more timely, focused, and higher frequency data. All of which are of course essential for developing and monitoring the policies around the pandemic. And of course, if all that wasn't enough, we're having to do all of this in an environment of near 100% telework. So in this 100% virtual environment. But what's the good news here? The good news is that we are doing this, that we are being quite successful. We're delivering the critical data needed to gauge the economy and to monitor the pandemic. And in some cases, we are actually delivering more than we expected to be able to deliver. So if I reflect on the US for a moment, how have we been able to do this? How have we been able to accomplish this? And I think three themes emerge. The first is preparedness. The second is agility. And the third is collaboration. So let me start with preparedness. Going into the pandemic, the statistical agencies had very well developed and tested contingency plans in place. And what we saw is that we were able to execute those without much additional work. The consumer price index comes to mind, for example, as a great case of relying on well-established and tested sampling and imputation techniques to ensure quality and consistency, and we were able to implement those despite the smaller sample size during the pandemic. Another example of preparedness is our work on alternative data sources and techniques. This has been mentioned several times up to this point, but we've been using these as supplemental sources to our traditional data sources. But in the back of our mind, we've all been waiting for the day when we would need to use these alternative data sources as the primary data source in current period estimates. And I think that work has really set the stage for us to be able to transition nicely to making use of these in the current period estimates. And that's what we've been able to do in the US. So for example, in our most recent GDP estimates, we were able to successfully use credit card transactions to fill in some major gaps in our measures of consumer spending in our GDP aggregates. Now turning to the theme of agility, we were well positioned across the system to quickly transform from in-person modes of data collection to web-based and telephone-based modes of data collection. And what I saw was that this created very little disruptions, very few disruptions. Having this multi-mode agenda already in place really gave us a smooth transition, and in most cases, kept our response rates relatively unchanged. Continuing with this theme of agility, we've also been able to quickly augment many of our existing surveys to include new COVID-related questions that address key aspects of the pandemic. So this has required very rapid development, testing, and approval of these new questions. And it's also required a very dynamic process between these 125 agencies that I mentioned a moment ago and the statistician, the chief statistician's office. Again, in a decentralized system, this is a particular challenge, getting that the sort of the logistics of getting new questions added to even traditional surveys. And finally, on the agility front, we've been able to accelerate the availability of some of our most critical statistics, especially those based on administrative data. Of course, this doesn't mean that we necessarily have the same coverage that we would normally have, or that we're as happy with the coverage that we would normally have. But for some of the most critical statistics, for example, the COVID-19 death counts or the associated excess deaths, we feel that there is a need to be as flexible as possible to get the initial data out and then to update the data as additional information has become available. The final theme that I would like to mention is collaboration. And I can honestly say I have never seen a time when the US statistical system has worked more effectively than it has during the current pandemic. So let's go to the next slide, please. A great example of this collaboration is our new Household Pulse survey. So this is a joint effort across the US statistical system with the goal of providing real-time data on the COVID experience, the household experience. And what we see is that the survey is focused on a number of key areas. So just to quickly mention those, it's looking at employment status, spending patterns, physical and mental health, access to healthcare, food security, housing, and educational disruption. The survey collects information from across the US at approximately 8-day intervals. It provides a real-time snapshot of the pandemic from the perspective, as I said, of the household. And the survey has gotten tremendous press coverage. And it's just a really great example of how we were able to make statistics extremely relevant. And what I find particularly amazing about this endeavor is as I said a moment ago, the collaborative aspect. We were able to coordinate across all of the involved agencies. We were able to design a web questionnaire, and we were able to get the survey in the field in all about 1 month. And I'm not speaking for the rest of the folks, but for the US, that's a pretty amazing accomplishment. This is just one example of the type of collaboration that's taking place across the statistical system. This kind of cross-agency work was obviously necessitated by the needs of the pandemic. But what we're thinking and what we're seeing is that this has created a path, it's created a work plan and agenda to continue this kind of collaboration well into the future. And we'll talk a little bit about those aspects in the second part of this panel discussion. So with that, I'll stop and turn it back to you, Paul. Thank you.
Many thanks, Brian, for this very stimulating presentation. We talk about data ecosystems, and the US decentralized system is probably the prototype of an ecosystem when it comes to statistics. So it's great to hear how well it has been operated under the crisis. Let me now turn to Tudorel to give us some insights into the Romanian experience and what sort of new initiatives the Institute for Statistics took there. Over to you, Tudor.
Good afternoon, Paul. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity of having this presentation in this panel. My presentation will be about our experience concerning the activity during the pandemics. The Romanian National Institute of Statistics had to adapt its working practices to the new national and international context. In the first slide, I will launch three essential questions concerning our statistical activity during this crisis. Starting mid-March, we found ourselves in a new reality where the traditional data collection methods are not suitable anymore. We asked ourselves, how do you maintain the health status of our personnel in the central unit and in the territory? This was not an easy question to answer, as over 2,000 employees are working in our organization. After this, I can say that this was the first priority and also was very difficult to assure in the very short period. Secondly, how do we continue to provide our current statistical indicators for economic agents and households? Concerning the first category, I would like to underline that starting mid-March, the activity in most of the enterprises reduced and many companies closed. It was not very difficult to solve these issues because the data collection process is electronical. However, it was crucial to convince the agents to offer the data in a short run period. Concerning the second category, it was much more difficult because the emergency state obliged everybody to reduce unnecessary physical contact. In this respect, we use phone and online collection. This was very difficult because in a short period, we changed completely the possibility to collect the data from households. In just a few days, we understood that the crisis generated by the spread of the virus is not only a sanitary one, but also an economic crisis. Additionally, we asked ourselves, it is worth measuring the economic impact of COVID. Under these circumstances, the activity at the level of the Institute has completely changed. In this respect, we decided to create an emergency unit for maintaining the current statistical production. Also, we created an emergency unit for measuring the economic impact of COVID in a timely manner. In response to our users' needs, we measured the economic impact of this pandemic for March and April, and we developed a methodology to measure the impact of COVID from a social and demographic point of view. These first results within the social and demographic area will be available this summer. In the second slide, I will detail the responsibility of the emergency unit in charge with the evaluation of the economic contraction. Firstly, we had to identify new reliable data sources because the activity of most economic units has been reduced or closed. Secondly, we had to find suitable quantitative techniques to collect and analyze them, as the characteristic of the primary data has changed. We defined our strategy for producing new indicators because the microdata are historically available and we have a strong network in charge with collecting the data in the territory. Third, we had to assure transparency and the constant presence of the Institute in the media and to fight against the fake news. Based on these responsibilities, we designed in a few days the methodology for 3 ad hoc studies. The first study was for estimating the size of the reduction of the activity in the economy and for the sectors during the period March-April. The second ad hoc study was for estimating the size of the contraction of the foreign trade activity during the same period, March-April. In both cases, we combined historical data and qualitative evaluation, which were gathered at the level of representative samples of economic units. We had to find an optimal balance between quality, timeliness, and the speed of obtaining this essential information for all categories of users. Now, I can say that the Institute was between the first institutions at national level which made this estimation. 3 months after these estimations, we can appreciate that these were reliable. The estimation of the CPI using waste scrapping, taking into account the fact that during the crisis, online retail increased, was an important task. This was very important for us to realize in a very short run. And for us, this was possible because 6 years ago, in the Institute was created a small unit in charge to introduce new instruments in our production and to use big data to produce experimental statistics. We learned a lot from this crisis, and this experience can be resumed in a few words. Teleworking and human resources, because these were a crucial element to support the current production and to realize the ad hoc studies, experimental statistics, and here I would like to underline the crucial role played by Eurostat, because lately Eurostat stimulated us all the time to produce experimental statistics in our institutions. And finally, flexibility, because I think for a modern official statistics, this is a very important characteristic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tudorel, for this, for sharing these lessons from Romania. And you already provided a nice transition to Eurostat, and I will therefore call directly on Mariana, please.
Hello, do you hear me? Please.
Yes, we hear you,
okay.
Mariana.
Hello to everybody. So I'm happy to take the floor from Tudorel. We could go to the first slide, please. I'm in a privileged position to speak after so many good people. So I will try to emphasize just few points from Eurostat presentation, because you could look at it later, and many things have been said. So it's a very good question to summarize in few lines what was the most challenging and what has been at the same time expiring during the crisis. I'm not going to speak about difficulties with primary collection and challenge to keep statistical releases as planned and with required quality, because you are all well familiar with that. You have went through this. My first point, which I wanted to emphasize, is from our point of view, from a point of view of supranational organization, the biggest challenge for us was for Eurostat, in this case, to provide the methodological support and to ensure comparability across countries. As Paul said at the beginning, we are used to discuss, to exchange ideas, how to do this or that better. But what we had to do in the crisis, we had a couple of days really to make a decision, to discuss with the experts and to provide clear guidance how to address one or another issue in order to ensure that the data are comparable. In that respect, as Brian said, the speed was decisive, the collaboration was decisive, and also it was necessary to take really bold decisions. In that respect, Eurostat published a number of crucial guidance notes, which were initially targeted at European statistical system. They were elaborated in cooperation between Eurostat and European experts. But what we wanted to do and what we did is that while we were developing these guidelines for Europe, we wanted to be sure that these guidelines will be compatible and with the rest of the world and with other international organizations. So what you at national level, maybe you haven't seen it very well because you are dealing with a number of national issues. I would like to use this opportunity to say that we had to react very quickly with ILO, with OECD, with UN, different organizations. And when Eurostat published the methodological guidelines, at that moment of time, we had ensured that they are in line with international organizations. And also we work in parallel to bring contributions to international guidelines. So this is something what is important. I am not going to speak about challenge to communicate under uncertainty because many people have covered this point even in the previous sessions. So if we go to the next slide, my next point which I wanted to stress is the point which I could put under the title of being even more relevant. To be relevant under the crisis, to find exactly what is needed during the crisis was one big challenge. And then, sorry, this is my other 3,000 things coming on my screen. Sorry for that. So in that respect, what I wanted to emphasize concerning the relevance is the prioritization which we did in the European statistical system, really at the very beginning to identify those statistics which are extremely relevant for the crisis, mainly macroeconomic and short-term statistics, and to put all our efforts to ensure that we will produce them on time with the necessary quality and in a comparable way. The second point related to the relevance was that, as I think it was Brian who mentioned this, but I think also the previous speakers mentioned, there was ever increasing need for high frequency data, and many national statistical offices started to do that. The big challenge for international or supranational organization is whether it's possible to organize quickly in a harmonized way such new data collection or data collection with higher frequency. And therefore, I have to admit that this is difficult. In the current crisis, as we discussed with the European statistical system, we would like to be even more responsive, to organize ourselves even faster, because of course we had many initiatives at national level, but they were not coordinated, let's say, in advance. And the results, of course, they have their role. They showed that statistical offices are responsive. They met the national needs, but the question for the future is whether we need to go beyond this national responsiveness and to do something coordinated quickly at international level. In that respect, in one of the next slides, because we could stay here, the next slides are just illustration. So since you click, this is the illustration of methodological guidelines, but if you go one slide next, please. There is illustration of the things which have been launched, new things during the crisis. Eurostat put a dedicated section. The most important thing here for this audience is that we provided a link to all the national statistical offices dedicated sections. So we try to advertise what the national statistical offices did in European statistical system, and then we receive many questions as Eurostat. This is excellent in that country or in another country. Could we do this for all countries in the European statistical system quickly? So that's why I am coming to my point that the question for the future is whether we could be organized to do something at international level more coordinated, and whether it's feasible and whether it's needed. The next slide, which is again an illustration. This is an illustration of what European statistical system did extremely quickly to organize something for all the countries. This is weekly deaths reporting. In a less than a month, thanks to my colleagues in the European statistical system, we managed to organize time series back to 2000 for weekly deaths for all ESS countries with detailed breakdowns by age, sex and region. And actually we published the first analysis today, 2 hours and a half ago. And this is this exercise just illustrates that it's possible on a voluntary basis, and when we are organized, to have something as a collective response. Then we could move to the next slide. My next point, which I wanted to emphasize, is in the title in the slide, because this is important for the future. One of the conclusions for me from this crisis or observation is that the profile of NSIs has been expanded. And there are 3 illustrations on this slide how the profile has been expanded. First, many of you mentioned the strategic partnership to complement different skills and to do something new during the crisis, for example, with health ministries or mapping agencies. Then the second illustration is that data hubs have been created. Statistical offices play an integrating role, and they put together different sources, providing then access to researchers, for example, or to any other parts. And the last example of expanding role relates to the fact that in addition to the traditional methodological support which statistical offices provide, for example, to provide sampling for national prevalence surveys, prevalence of COVID-19, the statistical offices started to provide analytical services for different government organizations, which are not necessarily to be published, but for sure they had to be done very quickly in a very agile way. So my next point, before I just put 3 questions for the future, and my last point, most of the people spoke about production, about communication, about data collection, about technical methods. But one very important part was how we organized our offices inside and how we collaborate across the countries and across organizations. In the first slide of Brian, there were a couple of points of that the resources were reorganized, that the system had to be adjusted. So I just wanted to emphasize once again that it was crucial to have very good internal coordination, internal communication to keep staff supported, staff motivated, especially when they are teleworking, to have a very good coordination among different parts of the statistical house, and also to have permanent coordination, in our case, between countries and Eurostat at all levels. My dear colleagues, Director Generals of statistical offices in the ESS established a permanent contact, and we had regular video conferences in order to really prioritize and to find the right decisions. My last slide. Paul, I don't know whether maybe this is for now, but let me raise the questions and then I could come again. Questions for the post-pandemic times. First question, with which I would like to contribute to the discussion: how to leverage the partnerships, innovative solutions, access to new data sources, and organizational improvements during the crisis. What to take with us, what should rest with us, and what we could keep for the future. Second question, how to benefit from the momentum of expanded profile and enhanced reputation of official statistics during the crisis. Several of you mentioned that we have to use the momentum, that we shouldn't miss a good crisis, and this is very important to keep the momentum in that respect and to position ourselves in the emerging data ecosystems. And then to be prepared for the future crisis. When Brian was speaking, he said his first word was preparedness. And he said that they were doing successfully in US because they have been prepared. But preparation, for me, is a bigger concept. It's not just an organizational preparation and business continuity plan. Preparation is, we were prepared for the crisis, as Brian and Teodoros said, because we have been investing in experimental statistics, in new data sources, in partnerships. We have the proper IT infrastructure. And then in that sense, we have to, my last question is, should we continue focusing on building the particular digital infrastructure, capacity and frameworks, which will ensure that we will be even more agile and flexible in responding to the future crisis? So these are the three questions which I see that we should need to discuss in order to continue to play our role even in a more prominent way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you also for putting up the question. We will have an opportunity to come back to those, I think, in the second round when we look forward, and you will have further opportunity to bring in your ideas there. Thank you very much also for reminding us of the issue of international comparability, which is something that has surfaced quite visibly, I think, during the crisis, and where you explain very well the role that Eurostat has played and the challenges before us. Our last contributor to this session is Mark Soden from New Zealand. So Mark, the floor is yours. We'll put up your slides. Here we are. Mark, are you online? Or did we lose you? Mark, is your mic muted still? We can't hear you. Okay, I'm afraid we can't.
Now he's moved.
Okay, I'm afraid we can't hear Mark.
Paul, there is a message from Mark in chat that he is having connection issues and he'll try to rejoin.
All right. Okay. Well, given that, maybe we should move on then and start the discussion around the issues that we've just heard from the first three presenters. And when Mark is available, he can come back. He can come back in later. So, what I'd like to do is open the floor for participants to come in with comments, questions for our panelists. Please raise your hand, and so you can take the floor directly, or indicate in the chat box that you want to speak up. I do have actually a question from Mexico that was delivered ahead of time in written form, so maybe I'll throw that out immediately. It actually follows up to some of the things that were discussed in the earlier session, namely whether in your cases, any criteria had been developed to find a balance between between different criteria, between different quality criteria. Is there a trade-off between accuracy and timeliness that had to be made during the crisis in order to supply the data that was necessary? We already heard some of the responses to that question from the UK and others, but maybe that's a good point to start. My impression from Brian's intervention was that didn't seem to have been a big issue, for example, in the United States. Brian, would you have any comment on that question raised by Mexico?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I would just add that no, I think it is an important issue, and I think that what we heard from policymakers was that they needed this information quickly. So, for example, the information around death counts or excess deaths, and we needed to provide those data quickly, and that there was a trade-off. But at the same time, the idea was let's provide the data that we can provide, but be very clear about what it is we're providing. So be very transparent, make sure we have the trust of the public and the policymakers, and then continue to update those data as we go forward. So yeah, there was a trade-off, but I think what we tried to do was try to put context around it, because as we talked about in the earlier session, if you come in too late, then what you're providing might be high quality, but not particularly useful.
Indeed, I think in the chat, in the former session also, somewhat I think brought in the well-established notion actually that quality has several dimensions. I mean, it's timeliness, it's accuracy, and of course it's relevance, and all these things need to be brought together or traded off. Does either Tudorel or Mariana have anything to comment back on this question that Mexico had put forward?
Mark is back.
Okay.
Yes, I would like to say that he's back, Mark. So maybe we should give the floor to him.
All right.
Otherwise, good. I could easily subscribe to what Brian said. Yes.
Very good. As Mark is back, let's move to his presentation. Yes, it's been put up. So the floor is yours, Mark, if the mic works now. Very good.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me this time?
Yes, we can hear you. Please speak. Please go ahead.
Okay, is that better now? Can people hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So so thank you very much for the opportunity, and sorry for the technical issues. If I can have my next slide, please. Can I have my next slide?
I think we've lost you again, Mike. Mark, sorry. Mark, maybe you want to try without the video. That may gain us some bandwidth so we can hear you again.
Okay, so is that better?
Yes, that's better. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so yes, I have my next slide. So sorry about this. So look, as you will see from that slide, New Zealand had a slightly different context, I think. So our experience is very similar to other countries, and I'll reflect on that in a moment. But the our overall national picture was actually quite different. So we had comparatively low overall cases of COVID, and we went into lockdown very early. Our government decided to go into lockdown very early, which meant that we went into lockdown before there was widespread outbreak, which meant that the outbreak didn't actually last very long in New Zealand, and so we were able to go back into low restriction, and now we basically have, apart from our international borders being closed, we have no restrictions at all. So we had a short, what I would describe as being very much a short, sharp impact on our business, but we're now actually back to normal. So reflecting really on what we found during that period, and like others, our entire organisation moved out of our offices and moved to working from remote locations, and all our field survey interviewers were withdrawn from the field. So again, like others, we had very much an increase in demand for our services and for our data, and for data to come faster, just the same as others, but also had the problem of a great reduction in supply of our data, because basically all of our, or a very good deal of our information comes either from household surveys, business surveys, or having field collectors in shops doing pricing and so forth. So we pretty quickly had to pivot to other options. So if I can have my next slide, please. So this is just an illustration of, I'm not going to talk to each of these, this is just an illustration of some of the other data sources that we used and published. But effectively, we moved to a situation where, just as others have done, relied on administrative data. So relied on data that we already held or already collected, and data that we collected from other agencies like our tax agency and our social welfare agency around payment of benefits and wage subsidies to people who were becoming unemployed. We also moved very quickly to phone surveys, so we replaced our field surveys with phone surveys and also with web scraping. But we found ourselves in a world where we also relied heavily on new data sources. So data sources that we either didn't have access to at all, or had just been starting to experiment with. So some of the examples of the new data sources we used, we got access to cell phone data. So we were able to look at, so this is all anonymized cell phone data. We were able to look at population movements and population behavior using cell phone data, and being able to trace movements of the population almost hour by hour to understand how the population was moving. We got access to bank transaction data and credit card data, so we were able to use that to make estimates of spending. And again, we used this both to backfill our statistical data, gaps, but also to provide general patterns of behaviour to government as well around how was the New Zealand population behaving, what was happening to broad spending patterns. So we're able to use this to produce both our statistics, but also some of the indicative data that others have talked about in earlier sessions, about trying to give a sense of how things are going, an early sense of how things are going to policymakers. We also got access to supermarket data, so supermarket price data. So instead of having our people in the field collecting price data for our CPIs and inflation measurement, we actually had supermarket data as well. And then we had to have, so they were new ways of collecting data that we moved to. We also moved to new ways of presenting data. So like others, we were under a lot of demand from policymakers and the general New Zealand public. There was a very high interest in the general New Zealand public and the media to understand what was happening. So we moved to new ways of presenting data for the system as a whole, because the New Zealand government or my organisation has a role both as government statistician, but also a system lead role, so a government chief data steward role. So we were responsible for the data provided by the whole system. And this slide that's in front of you here is what we call our data portal. So we've created a COVID-19 data portal, which collects all of the data that the New Zealand government holds, and also draws on a range of data from the private sector as well, to put in one place everything that we can find out about what's happening to New Zealand as a result of the pandemic. And so this was stood up during the pandemic. It was stood up in a pretty big hurry, and it includes, as you'll see from there, a really wide cross section about health data, data around job losses and beneficiary numbers, and a lot on economic data as well, including trade data, consumer spending, business and consumer confidence, use of the internet, electricity demand, fuel supply, milk production, cargo and transport volumes. And we work really hard to pull all of this information from, as I say, other government agencies, but also from around a range of private sector banks that produce their own indices and private firms. So this is just an example of how we had to find new ways to present the data to meet the demand. Can I have my next slide, please? So we also found new products that we created as well. So there's we have Stats New Zealand has an offshoot innovation organisation called Data Ventures, and Data Ventures pulled together. So they went out and got the telecom cell phone data that I talked about. They also got the bank data that I talked about, and they created some products for New Zealand, which basically talked about population movement. So this enabled us to be able to advise the government around how the New Zealand population was behaving under lockdown, and were we adhering to lockdown by looking at spending data and spending patterns and population movement data based on cell phones. Now this was useful just for general kind of there was a general move from the government to try and encourage New Zealanders to adhere to the lockdown, as there is in every country. But this was actually used very actively in a publicity campaign by the New Zealand government to say, yes, we are doing what we need to, or no, actually we're not, we need to make extra effort. So we found data being used in that way, but also drawn very heavily into the modelling work that was done in terms of the pandemic modelling and the likely modelling of infection rates and so forth, which then led into decisions about when to ease the lockdown and so forth. So we also found ourselves drawn fairly heavily into the decisions actually about length of lockdown. So I think if I just to try and wrap up and try and draw some themes together, I think like others, I think there's three themes to me. One is around planning and the benefit of some of the planning that we had done. And that's around we had a significant earthquake in New Zealand back in 2016, and Stats New Zealand actually lost our building as part of that and lost all of our IT. So we were ahead of the curve compared to a range of other New Zealand government agencies in terms of flexible working, IT as a service, laptops and so forth, which did mean that we could pretty much pick up our computers and walk out the door. So we were lucky in that regard. But also a lot of planning and pre-work had gone into getting these data sources that I've talked about. We actually were on the verge before the pandemic of signing the agreement with the cell phone companies, for example. We were quite well advanced with the bank data, getting access to bank data, because we were going to do that anyway as an admin data source. So we benefited a lot from a lot of pre-work, some of which was related specifically to disaster planning, but some of it was actually just the work we were doing for our business. Second key theme, I think, is around agility. Again, as others have mentioned, we had to move faster. We had to move to things like phone surveys rather than face-to-face surveying very, very quickly. We had to move to active following up on our business surveys very quickly. And I ended up putting a good deal of my call centre into the whole of government call centre, actually loaned them to the whole of government effort, because there was a very large help desk call centre that the broader New Zealand government set up. And then finally, the final theme I talk about is, again, as others have, collaboration. A lot of the data that I've talked about that we use to both backfill our own data gaps and to provide insights into to New Zealand and to the New Zealand government came from collaboration with the private sector. And some of that was based on pre-existing relationships, and some of it was just based on real urgency about get out and actually collaborate. So I think I have another slide which is about thoughts for the future, but I'll leave that there because I think we're going to come back to that. So I'll stop at this point and leave back to the floor.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the New Zealand experience. I see It lines up very nicely with some of the things we heard before, in particular from Brian. You mentioned preparedness, agility, collaboration. Those are clearly three areas that we've been seeing. I've been looking at the chat box as well. There are some themes that came up there. One is, of course, the question, well, how will the transition back from crisis mode to normal mode look like in terms of the preparedness there, IT-wise, HRM-wise? So that's one issue that we'll probably come back to in the second round. I think Ivo asked whether we need a new data quality framework, given that maybe there's a broader range of statistics that we are called upon to produce in this new ecosystem of data. And it certainly is a good point to also reflect on what we can learn from our failures or things that may not have happened during the crisis. So before sort of looking ahead, let me ask if anyone wants to come in by way of a comment or a question at this point. Okay, I don't see any live interventions. So that's actually a good moment to turn back to the panel and to ask them to give us a few thoughts about looking ahead. Okay, so some of the things that I mentioned, how do we go back into normal mode? What are the lessons learned? Which are the things that can be sustained and which are the things that were clearly of a short-term nature? What are the lessons to take on? Maybe I'll start with Mariana, because she already had three nice questions up there that pointed in that direction. So Mariana, if you want to add a few more thoughts to that, that would be a good start for this second round.
Thank you very much, Paul. I actually asked the questions. I do not pretend to have the answers.
I thought you had the answers in the second round, you see.
Yeah. Okay, but I will take this opportunity maybe to respond to some of the very nice comments in the chat panel, because they give me opportunity to share something more. When I read the question from Ivo from UNSD, whether we need a quality framework to be adjusted, then when I'm thinking about what to take from the crisis, my first association which comes to my mind, including to quality frameworks, is: do we have a shift in time series in the sense that our work after the crisis will be shifted to a completely different level, or the crisis is just an outlier and we have to go back to the normal? And my personal opinion is that we have a shift in time series, because actually the crisis underscored some of the developments which we were already which we have undertook, but we are not enough advanced, or we were just on the way. In that respect, for example, I don't think that we will come back to the mode of paper or face-to-face interviews in the same scale. This is a question from Russia as well. I think that forever we have changed the mode of data collection during the crisis. And one of the priorities, for example, for Eurostat team together with the ESS colleagues, is taking place actually now, to define exactly the questions we need to answer. What are the long-lasting effects of data collection, including the mode of data collection, because the mode of data collection will have impact on the length of the questionnaire, on definitions of the structure of questionnaires, for example. So that's why I think we have shift in our time series, and we need to really reflect what are the changes in the data collection, what are the changes in terms of products, whether we have to add to our permanent mix more frequent statistics, more experimental statistics, in which areas, and then of course, if depending on our answer, we could see whether we need to adjust quality framework methodologies, etc. And maybe we could discuss whether we should take domain by domain approach to see, to be pragmatic, and we could see then what could be the cross-sectional implications. My final point, I fully agree with Julio that it's more difficult to come back after the crisis than to enter into the lockdown measures. And we are focusing on statistics, but I think we have very many lessons to learn as managers of human resources, of financial resources, etc. And maybe we should also keep this point into our minds, you know, to exchange experience, how we have come back, what does it mean mainly for people, for infrastructure, for our famous GSP, our model of production, etc., the prominent role, for example, of geospatial. So we have to think what are the implications on organization of our offices and statistical production. Yes, I will stop here to give opportunity to the others.
Thank you, Mariana. Maybe I'll turn over to Teodorella. I should say that there's a lot of interesting points coming through in the chats as well. One question, for example, was when there's such strong demand from all sorts of stakeholders, how do you prioritize them? Is government the first one to get new information? Is it civil society? So this plays out into the whole area of communication and dealing with stakeholders. So there are many things I think that are useful to consider here. But let me hand over to Teodorel to give us his view of what the main lessons are going forward.
Very interesting question. And here I have a personal example. In the mid-March, we had to choose between two alternatives in our institute. Firstly, to produce only classical indicators, and secondly, to do a mix between experimental statistics and classical traditional indicators. But for me, it was very easy to choose between the two alternatives because policymakers and a lot of users demanded to estimate the contraction of the economy. And as Brian said, for official statistics, it's very important to decide between quality, timeliness, and granularity. Because during the crisis, for all policymakers, it is very important to take decision. But decision without data, it is very, very difficult. This is the conclusion. For official statistics during the crisis, it is important to produce new statistics. This is mandatory.
Thank you, Teodorel. Maybe I'll turn to Mark next because it's very late in New Zealand, so he may want to come in. Mark, if you're still there, please go ahead.
Sure, thank you. Can I just, given the problems I had before, can I just check? Can you hear me again?
Yes, very well.
Good.
Thank
you. Look, I think I'll make a few comments and then perhaps come back to a few comments about general lessons and then come back to the priorities point because I think it was something that we had to be very clear on. I think the things for us that I want to take forward are the new data sources. So when I look at some of the comments in the chat is exactly where my thinking is at, that this is a good opportunity to review. Actually, is face-to-face interviewing really the way to go? And is it actually the future? Because if I stand back and I think about what we've learned from COVID, We're also facing, as I believe others are, decreasing response rates through face-to-face surveys and increasing costs to keep those face-to-face survey response rates up. So I think now is a really good opportunity to actually just stand back and say, we tried, we all tried across a range of statistical agencies, some of the alternatives to face-to-face surveying. Let's see what we learn from those, and let's see what's applicable, because I think we've all got more systemic problems with our business models around face-to-face surveying. So that's certainly one thing. I'm really keen to try and keep within New Zealand the data sources that I talked about that we've got from the private sector. So the bank data, the telecom companies' data, the power company data, and I think again not only from an administrative data and using administrative data to produce statistics, but also actually the work that some of the experimental work that we've done with that data has shown that we can do all sorts of things that we never thought we would be able to do with that data in terms of broader analysis about New Zealand and our economy and society. So I think the challenge is how do we keep those data sources? How do we get and maintain the social license to hold those data sources as well? Someone mentioned in an earlier presentation around data governance, and I do think that data governance is going to need to be a focus in New Zealand going forward, because we need to figure out a way that we can maintain the confidence of the companies that give us that data, but also society to allow us to have the data. The last point I'd just make, I think, is around collaboration. So again, I talked about collaboration, and others have as well. I think what our organisation has learned a lot. I've talked a lot in my organisation about having the customer around the table. And being able to collaborate and work with others. I think we've seen the value of that a lot over the past 3 months as this has rolled through New Zealand, and I think have now seen we'll now see a really big focus on that. So I think we've got a good opportunity to get a step change in the amount of collaboration we do. So again, it's capitalise on that. The last thing I'll just say is in terms of the questions around priorities. So pretty early on, we faced exactly that question about who are we actually trying to provide data for? And we decided that firstly it was actually ministers and decision makers, so our government, around actually understanding COVID and allowing them to take decisions about the response. And then secondly, it was about measuring the impact of COVID on the New Zealand economy and society. So we pretty much decided just the ministerial decision makers were first, and then the broader New Zealand public, because we did see the value of data to the broader debate about were we doing the right thing in New Zealand, were we adhering to the lockdown rules, was frankly the way the government was handling it the right policy response, etc. So there was quite a lot about informing public debate, but it was very much that was secondary to continuing to serve ministers and decision makers. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Mark. There is an interesting side discussion ongoing in the chat about CASI. I think it was Yoel Finkel from Israel who launched it. CASI stands for Computer-Assisted Zoom Interviewing. So I don't know if Yoel wants to say something about this, or if not, it'd be great to have some information or link to this model that you're pursuing that maybe you can share with everyone. All right, let me now turn to Brian to give us his perspective forwards on the lessons out of the crisis. Brian, please.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. So I'll just start by saying what others have already said, that the COVID-19 experience has provided, in a way, some real momentum for the statistical community. I think it's really helped us realize what we can do. In particular, as we've been saying, to react more quickly and to make statistics more responsive to the policy needs. I also think this experience has impacted our mindset in a very positive way. Many of us, at least speaking for the U.S., we've been pushed out of our comfort zones particularly around this trade-off we've been discussing between quality and timeliness. But I think what we've learned is that there's a lot to be gained from being extremely proactive and, frankly, from taking a bit of risk. I think the statistical community tends to be pretty risk adverse, and I think this has enlightened us a little bit, and I think we're seeing some wins from that, and I think it's giving us positive reinforcement. I guess I would just make the point that's been made by many, by others, but it is extremely important to proactively communicate with our customers in order to promote transparency and maintain trust. I don't think we could emphasize that enough. Whether we're talking about setting priorities, whether we're talking about this quality timeliness trade-off, this idea of trust is so important. And as some of you know, I recently joined the CDC in the United States, so I'm now working for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And if you've been following the news lately, the sort of the issues around trust there have really come to light. So I'm experiencing firsthand how powerful that aspect is. If I look at some of the most important lessons we've learned, I would go back to a couple of points I made earlier, which is having robust contingency plans is certainly something that's very important in being able to rapidly implement them. That lets us focus more on the execution and less on trying to figure out what we need to do in the moment of crisis. We've also learned that our traditional surveys and survey tools need to be as flexible as possible. We need to be able to quickly change questions, change modes of collection, change frequency of our collected data. I mean, I think that stuff sounds very basic and elementary, but if you don't build that in, you really do spend a lot of time doing things that you could have done ahead of time and could really save time in the moment of crisis. Another major takeaway is realizing just how important our work is on big data sources, administrative data sources, and data science techniques. Going forward, what we need, in my opinion, what we need to focus more on are the specific separable modules that can be applied more broadly across our various statistical programs. So, we've done a lot of work in this area, but it's often been very focused on specific aspects of the accounts. And what we're discovering is that some of these modules that we're developing can be more broadly applicable to various components across the statistical system. So I think we need to work harder on that. And I also think we can work a little harder on being able to the interoperability between the traditional data sources and these alternative data sources, or this notion of sometimes referred to as blending of these alternative data sources. Returning to a point that I made earlier, I can't say, and that others have made, I can't say how important this collaboration is, particularly in the U.S. where we have the decentralized system, but for everyone. We've experienced, as I mentioned a moment ago, some wins around this household pulse survey, but we need to look for more opportunities like that. It shouldn't be only in the face of a crisis does something like that come to bear. We should be thinking about that, trying to exploit all the opportunities. And I think, as we've said in other forums, the world of statistics and the NSOs has changed. We've got this evidence-based policy-making work ahead of us that is going to completely change the way we think about what we provide and how we provide that information to policymakers. My final point, and perhaps most importantly in many ways, is what we have learned and how much we need to appreciate the resiliency and the flexibility of our statistical agency staff. We were able to quickly shift staff from one program to another, depending on the needs, depending on these additional demands that we've been mentioning. And we were actually able to do this in a virtual environment with frankly, not much of a drop in productivity. So going forward, one of the big things on our plate is to think about these human capital platforms, take a fresh look at these human capital platforms with the goal of even further increasing staff versatility and flexibility. As well as I think when this is all over, we need to spend some considerable time recognizing the great contributions that the statistical staff have made to our NSO operations. So with that, Paul, I'll turn it back to you.
Many thanks, Brian, for those excellent comments. We are almost 10 minutes to the end of the session, and I see there's still a lot of very interesting discussions ongoing in the chat. But maybe what I will try and do is to summarize a little bit what I have heard, notwithstanding that there's a lot of extra material that we will not lose because it is there in written form. But let me just go through a few things that I'm taking away from this extremely interesting discussion, and then maybe turn to Anil to see if he has any final words for our group here. It is clear, and I think not only through this session now, but also the things that we heard earlier and in the preceding days, that COVID really has accelerated many statistical processes during the crisis, how NSOs operate, what sort of tools and data they are using. What I think came out very clearly in the discussion here was that there is an importance of international guidance and international coordination in this. There's a lot of demand domestically, and people, stakeholders ask what is going on, but there are just as many questions about how does a particular country compare with its neighbors, and the idea of international comparability of the data that comes out is quite important, and I think is something we want to retain here. A third point is also clear that not only have the NSOs during the crisis been doing very well in maintaining activity and supplying the information they are supposed to supply, we also saw a number of novel and additional initiatives, in particular with regards to measuring the impact of COVID on society or economies. We saw some reporting about surveys that were conducted. And of course, and in particular, in terms of new tools and new sources that were turned to deliver on the key information that is needed and has been needed during the crisis. Brian just mentioned the resilience of staff. I think this is something that is true in many places. I can speak for the OECD, but with many other people with whom I've conversed about this, everyone was really adamant about the fact that moving from zero, a very low level of teleworking, into 100% operational movements was really quite admirable and unexpected in many ways. The three words that we've heard repeatedly, and which bring with it a lot of action and initiatives, where preparedness, agility, and collaboration. I mean, they have come back in the discussion about what happened during the crisis, and they've come back in the discussion about where we are going from here. So what I see in terms of the lessons going forward I think no one, or I've heard absolutely no one say that, well, post-crisis will be simply going back to business as usual. I think, the very discussions that we're having here show that really, as Brian put it, our mindset has changed in a number of ways, and the view of what we're doing and how we can do things is moving ahead very quickly. A central theme going forward, and this came back in a number of interventions and as part of the presentations, is of course, how will we go about data collection in the longer term? What will be the long-lasting effects on that in terms of frequency, in terms of capacity to deal with face-to-face interviews, and in particular, with a view to keeping the news sources that have been identified and used rather effectively under the pressure of the crisis. There's been an interesting side discussion ongoing, a question that was posed to New Zealand, whether the news sources that we were able to mobilize under the crisis, would we be able to retain them afterwards? Or will they pull out as we move on? Because the readiness to supply data, say, from the private sector may have been very high under the crisis, but as we go back into normal mode, maybe that readiness declines. So is there something to be done to keep up the momentum there? With this little side issue on some participants wanting to know more about CASI, and I think Joel kindly indicated that he would provide some information on this technique. I have two or three more points going forward in terms of the lessons that I heard. The collaboration, I think that was mentioned in a number of cases within the national ecosystem of data producers, and maybe there are some things to be reviewed. It certainly extends to international collaboration as well, and maybe there is also room to think more actively about international co-investment between national statistical offices in new data sources, in new tools. So doing things jointly rather than at a national level. We have good examples of that. Maybe more can be done. And I think I will leave it here in terms of the few points that I retained by way of summary. But again, refer you to the chat that has taken place. There's a lot of additional very interesting points there. I'll stop here and turn to Anil for any further additional points that he may want to bring in. Thank you.
Well, allow me first of all to thank our panelists, Brian, Mariana, and Mark, as well as Paul, for what I think, as you can see from the chat session, has been a very, very rich session today. I would say, first of all, COVID is still in charge. We're not done yet. It may have some interesting twists and turns yet for us. So that's the first point. So it's still evolving, and I think our response will continue to evolve with it. Second is, obviously this isn't, as rich as the panel was. It's a sample of what countries are doing and international organizations are doing. I think there's a lot more, and I think maybe we need to do a census of lessons learned, just given how important this event is and the fact that it's still unfolding, the need to take a stock of the lessons that are being learned and what it means for all of us going forward is still something that needs a bit of a rigorous kind of approach. Lots and lots of rich themes, and in terms of what do you do when you're constrained in terms of supply of data and constrained in our ability to go about creating our own data, when the demand for both data and analytics are explode in the middle of a crisis. and the answer is innovation and collaboration and harvesting other sources to get at what is a constrained supply. We talked about infrastructure, both technical but statistical infrastructure, and its critical role during this time and how it's serving us well. Talking about really relying more on sources of data that we don't create and others have created, so that brings in all the the questions around standards and questions around quality, all the different dimensions of it, and the various trade-offs that we can bring. So this is more of a harvesting rather than creating kind of a move. And it's really about, instead of starting with data and then bringing our expertise, it's about how do you take the expertise to the data. And so again, that's shifting in many cases, the roles that we traditionally play in the NSOs. And so rightfully, the questions that have been asked about, what is that balance, if you like, of that role going forward? So which role is going to serve us, more when really the human factor becomes the risk, right? Which is what we're facing today. What are the systems that are going to be more resilient and more effective and more robust going forward? When we sort of add the unique dimensions of this crisis. So I think everybody's talked about what an amazing culture NSOs have, and the agility and the collaboration, and how people can come together, and how do we preserve that? That's the fundamental piece, going forward. So just a few reflections, colleagues. The first one is, we don't want to drink too much of our own Kool-Aid, and we don't want to become that self-licking ice cream, if you know what I mean. We really do need to step back a bit and not only assess how effective we've been during this crisis, but also do a little bit of thinking around who are the emerging players in this provision of information, and how do we compare to some of them. I think we can just look at the private sector and some of the companies that have become quite adept at dealing and working with data. What are they doing in this space at this point? And I think place ourselves in that relative ecosystem that is evolving very, very quickly. What are the incentives to propel us forward? Learn from, as I said in the chat, from some of our failures. Yes, we've had some great successes, and of course we all like to talk about our successes, but I think equally there are areas that perhaps are shifting, where perhaps we're not being as effective. Some of the challenges, I know in Canada we're facing tremendous challenges, and so we're going to have to rethink not just how we do things, but our role in the broader data ecosystem going forward. So what are those forces that perhaps are holding us back, and what are those things that are core and foundational that we're going to maintain and have to preserve? Domestic and international organizations, so what can we do better in terms of working together? What do we stop doing? What do we do differently? And where do we invest, being more robust? I mean, after the 2008 crisis, we invested in, Data Gaps 2, and a number of international organizations stepped up and said, clearly there's some challenges here, but, it's an international, move to filling some of these things. We should think about that. What are some of those things that international organizations can move forward that everybody then benefits from by signing on to some of those directions. And I think, again, many of you mentioned it, but telling our story to citizens. I mean, we're in a bit of a trust bubble, I would say. Citizens, when feeling vulnerable, put a lot of faith in governments. And I think we're probably, enjoying a little bit of that honeymoon. But populations can be fickle. Trust bubbles can burst. There will be days of reckoning. People will ask the tough questions of what difference did it really make? And I think we should be asking ourselves some of those tougher questions now, and making sure that we're aligned in terms of our responses. How did we in fact impact outcomes? What difference did we make? And making sure that trust with the public and what we do today to maintain that trust in doing things responsibly, handling their data, how do we protect privacy? All those things are going to be asked at some point, and so we should be asking ourselves some of those questions now and making sure that we're prepared. So I will stop there. An excellent conversation once again. It is by no means over. I would say let's keep the reflections going. Let's keep the learning happening, and let's figure out a systematic way to share some of these lessons and come up with a holistic strategy of where do we want the entire system to be so that nobody's left behind in this process. So with that, I will turn it now to Mario, if I have the orchestration right. And once again, thank the panelists and thank you, Paul, for this excellent presentation.
So hello, yes, it has been a tremendous joy to listen to all these great presentations and trying to keep up with the very good chat. So thank you, Paul, thank you, Anil, excellent session. So this ends our joint session. It has been first of a kind joint session. I must say also it is not so joint since I was checking the world clock on my iPhone, and I think New Zealand is already tomorrow, working in tomorrow's time. And if I understood correct, Mexico is very early morning still. So joint, but we work together, and I think if we think what we can carry on from the statistical work, one thing is also these modes of working, international sort of cooperation, because it is a long way from New Zealand to Mexico via Finland. So maybe some of this will help us in our working together. I think this is very important. One thing that was also on chat, when we come to, I think, basic statistical production is the data collection. There was the chat on data collection modes, and there's a group on data collection under UNEC, and there's at the moment right now, well, they say 3 o'clock, but who cares what the time is? 3 o'clock Geneva time. There's a meeting of the steering committee of the preparation of impact of COVID-19 on data collection. So this is an expert group that is working on these issues. Data quality, definitely an important issue, and also the new type of data sources that we can have. So I'm not going to wrap up, because this has been well done, and we will continue this work. There's many strands, and I know we will be busy. But to end the session, I would like to thank all the delegates who are so active, and all those who have contributed with papers, presentations to the discussions, the session and seminar organizers. I know you have been putting up a lot of work. Speakers, you have overcome the possible technical difficulties, and many of you I see are probably working from home. So well done. And then I would also like to thank the UNEC Secretariat. I have heard it has been a tremendous workload to come up with these technical solutions that made Monday, the official part, possible, and also these 2 days running along from New Zealand via Finland to Mexico to Canada, all these places. And of course, thank you, OECD, for this joint session. Good work, I must say. We congratulate ourselves. And as agreed, next CES plenary session will be held next year, 23rd to 25th a.m. June in Paris, in OECD, back-to-back with the OECD Committee on Statistics and Statistical Policy, and which is also going to continue tomorrow. So we have the 2 more days, but another platform to continue with. Thank you. Have a good morning, evening, rest of the day.
Thanks, Mario.
This meeting is no longer being